Hey everybody, good morning. Happy Wednesday. It is December 20th, the pre-Christmas episode of the Drop Set. Thanks for joining me here. What do we got? Episode 34. Yes. Once again, for the second week in a row, I can't remember what episode number it is, even though I deliberately looked it up before I started recording here. So we're doing it early. It's 9 o'clock Eastern. Well, roughly. You know, if I round up, it's 9:05 actually, but we're pretty close to 9 o'clock Eastern time. Broadcasting live on Instagram. Hey, recording for YouTube as well. And then the audio version that will go up on all of your favorite podcast sites, iTunes, Google Play, etc. So we're going to jump right into it today pretty quickly here. I just have a couple quick announcements to go over. What were they? We're going to talk about macros today. So this was a requested topic by a few people. I've talked about it before, but I wanted to dive into it for a full episode here and kind of go over comprehensive start to finish the who, what, when, where, how, and why of macros. So we'll do that shortly here. Just a couple quick announcements before we jump in. What do we have here? So first of all, I did put up a new video on YouTube next week. There'll be another one going up tomorrow or Friday. Last week's was all about off season and why it's a mistake to skip your off season, because it really is. A lot of people, especially competitive bodybuilders, they can pre-contest, they can cut all the time, and then if they're not doing that, they're not really doing much of anything. And that is a great recipe to A, screw up your body, and B, come in looking to show number 2 exactly the same as you did in show number 1. So off season is important. And to go along with that, I did also post a new workout plan, which is off season focused. So a lot of compounds, relatively heavy stuff, not a lot of fluff, pretty simple, basic stuff. But if you're looking for a little bit of structure just to help kind of guide your workouts through an off season phase, that is a great place to start. So you can find that if you go to 5starphysique.com and click on workout plans. I've got that listed there along with a bunch of others. Also, there, let me be desperate again and put out a plea. I would love any reviews that people could throw up for this podcast, specifically on iTunes. So if you listen there, or even if you don't, you can still go there and throw up a review, throw up a star review, leave a comment. That would be great. I would really, really, really appreciate it, just because that's how things get noticed. And some jackass gave me a 2-star review. So I need people to go up there and, well, first of all, clearly I need to be better at this so that I don't warrant a 2-star review. But I also I need to call out the troops. So if you just search like in your browser, or if you're in iTunes, you go to podcasts, you search for The Drop Set, it'll come up, and then you can review it from there. In your browser, you can just type in The Drop Set iTunes podcast, and it'll come up there as well. So anyway, that's that. That's all the announcements. That's all the fluff. Now we're going to jump right into it, talking about macros. So let me just give you an outline here of what we're going to be covering here. So the outline that I wrote up here, because I do like to plan ahead a little bit. I could just totally BS my way through this unplanned and it would turn out okay, but I find with a little bit of structure, it's harder for me to forget stuff. So the topics that I will be covering are macros for you, pros and cons. What does it mean if we're following a macronutrient-based plan? We're tracking numbers. What else really matters? We're going to talk about what are the macros, the things that we're tracking, what are the foods that they come from, pretty basic stuff. How do we approach a macronutrient-based plan? Because there's a lot of ways to do it. Some of them are better than others. This is like, how do you go about implementing it on a day-to-day basis? Constructing a plan based on your macronutrients, and then the basics of logging and how we do that. Not so much like what buttons to push, just because it's going to vary based on what app you use, but just some things that you can go about doing to kind of make sure that your accuracy is a little bit more improved overall. I'm going to shake things up a little bit here for Instagram. But oh my goodness, there's a zoom button on this. I complained last week about how the Instagram app for iPad is terrible because it puts everything in a tiny little window in the middle of a giant screen. There's a little zoom button, so it takes up the whole screen. I'm not sure I'm comfortable seeing myself quite that big, so I'm going to zoom it back down, actually. Okay, so topic number 1, are macros for you? That's the big question. And it's a question that I ask people when I start working with a new client. I have an assessment form for everybody to fill out, and one of the questions on there is, what do you want to do for nutrition? Do you feel like macros are best? Do you feel like a meal plan is best? I want to get your opinion on that if I'm going to be working with you. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to go with that. But I want to know what you're comfortable with, what seems like it would be more appropriate, because there are pros and cons of both. If we look at them as kind of look at the extreme ends of things. If you have a meal plan, the only way to really follow a meal plan correctly is to follow it 100% without any deviation. So you would do that if somebody says, I can't have any flexibility because I don't trust myself with that, which I'd say we should probably work on that. If you can't be trusted around food, I don't know if bodybuilding is a good thing. You need to make it so that you are trustworthy around food. That's a skill that you can improve upon. Or I just don't want to have to think about it. Okay, that's valid to some extent, but I think it's important that you do think about it because I want somebody to learn a little bit. I don't want to just say, here's your plan, here's your meal plan, and then this is the only thing that you know how to do. You're not learning anything along the way. You're eating everything, but you don't know what macronutrients are. It doesn't matter to you because you've got a meal plan. You aren't always going to have a meal plan. So I think learning, as a coach, what I do, I actually try to coach and teach people how to do stuff. I think it's important to, have some sense of not only what you're doing, but also why. I'm following this meal plan, but why is it constructed this way? If I was going to make changes to it on my own, what would be appropriate? What would be inappropriate? What are the tenets that go into the construction of this meal plan? So now, if you're going to follow a macronutrient-based plan, if somebody wants that, they want freedom, they want flexibility, they want the ability to kind of do things on their own terms. They don't want to be in dietary prison, as I call it, which certainly a meal plan can feel that way. But also, if you're on a meal plan, you should have some input like, yeah, so I'm going to follow this meal plan, but I don't really want to have tilapia 3 times a day. Can we do something about that? And if your coach says no, then that's a problem. So coming from somebody who doesn't like fish, if I had a coach that was non-negotiable on that coach would be fired because I want to look good, but I ain't gonna suffer like that to do it. So, and there are other ways to go about doing it for sure. So those are kind of the extreme ends, total flexibility or complete rigidity, but there's a lot of room in the middle as well. And if we follow a macronutrient-based plan, we can explore some of that middle room, and we'll talk about that later on. So what does it mean? So let's throw the whole meal plan concept out the window for right now temporarily. What does it mean if we're following a macronutrient-based plan? So what it means is you have a set of numbers that you've been given. Maybe you found them through an online calculator. Maybe you just randomly pulled some numbers out of your butt and you're just going to run with those and see how they work for you. Or you've got a coach that's providing numbers and perhaps some additional guidelines as well. So you've got to log your food. You've got to track everything. It gets to be, there's definitely a bell curve when it comes to tracking. So initially you've got this learning curve and you're like, oh, okay, all right. It's kind of a roller coaster more than a bell curve, I guess you could say. You've got this initial learning curve that you've got to get over. How does the app work? What does all this stuff mean? What are these numbers? What's important, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then after a while, you kind of get into a groove with it. And you're like, oh yeah, this isn't so bad. And then after a while, you're like, I've been doing this for so long. I'm sick of this. Log, add this, scan barcode, do quantity, serving size 2, et cetera. It starts to be where you get kind of like that augmented reality that you see in some apps where, if you're like holding your phone around and it's showing you through your camera what you're looking at, and then a little thing will appear above a door telling you what the name of the business is. It's kind of like that. You see that overlaid on your vision the whole time. You just walk around and you look at, oh, there's Applebee's. Well, I know what I can have there. It's this chicken salad thing and it's got 42 grams of protein. And that's how you kind of start to look at life a little bit. So that's kind of the next hump of the roller coaster, and then after that it kind of settles into like where you're just in a groove. You stop thinking about it so much. It becomes a little bit more automatic. Sure, you track it, but you're just a ninja with your tracking app, so it doesn't really take any time realistically. So it just understand that there are peaks and valleys in this as far as the effort involved and the difficulty involved is concerned. So if you expect that going in, then it's a little bit easier to swallow that pill. But you've got to track, everything for the most part. There are always exceptions to that. You've got to be consistent with it as well. And precision matters. So, if I set somebody a target, and let's just say for sake of argument, let's just make these numbers really easy. Let's say it's 150, 150, 50. So 150 grams of protein, 150 grams of carbs, 50 grams of fat. Low numbers, whatever, but we're just making stuff up. Margin of error on that stuff should be like, I would say if I'm being really, really generous, it should be like plus or minus 5%. So which isn't much. So that means for fats, your plus or minus 5% is 2.5 grams. So that means if the target's 50, I want you within like 47.5 to 52.5. So understanding what, and then for proteins and carbs, it's plus or minus 7.5. So that'd be like 142.5 to 157.5 for both of those. So pretty tight windows, but the other thing is it's doable. And if I said, I want you to hit those numbers exactly, that's doable also. I think it's, from my experience in working with people, it's less reasonable to expect that. And also, I don't find that there's a tremendous amount of value in trying to be that big of a stickler on precision. Plus or minus 5%, that's pretty good. That's fairly lenient, but also it's close enough to where, if I wanted to lower or increase fats by 10 grams, if you're precise enough within that window, then you'll be able to feel that, or we'll be able to get some benefit from raising or lowering it that much. So if your margin of error is all over the place, and let's say your protein's at 150 and you're hitting it somewhere between 130 and 170, I can't make a small change to that and have it be anything that's going to actually impact your body, just because you're already giving yourself such a wide berth with your accuracy there. So 5% absolute tops should be doable. So and again, those are my guidelines. So another thing is, we're tracking the numbers, but what else? And a lot of this stuff depends on where you get your numbers from. So the guideline that I give people is, plus or minus 5%. That's fairly generous. I want you to hit within that. There are additional guidelines that I provide, and some exemptions as well. And so those exemptions come from your source. So as an example, not all of my exemptions are universal. It kind of depends on the purpose. And by exemptions, I mean things that you don't have to track. Wherever your numbers come from, they should also provide additional guidelines, exemptions, anything like that. So you don't want to get your numbers from a calculator and then listen to me on what should be exempted from that. So I might tell somebody, like I mentioned, these rules are not universal. I change these up based on the person and what we're trying to do. I might say, hey, you know what? You don't have to track non-starchy veggies up to 4 cups a day. So, throw those in. And the idea there is, are those things calorically free of no value? No. But I've accounted for those when I've given you the numbers. So, a cup of veggies, let's say it's about 9 grams of carbs. There's some trace protein and fat in there, but we'll just talk about carbs for right now. So 4 cups would be 36. And, that means that, I'm accounting for that when I set your carb value. So they might be, 36 grams lower than they would be otherwise, understanding that those veggies are in there, because I don't want to micromanage that stuff. I don't want you to have to worry about that. I want you to get those in. It's just less stuff to log. And if somebody's like struggling to get everything in and they're having difficulty with the app, I want to try and make it easier for them. So I'm going to set some exemptions initially, and then later on we might remove those, and then I just need to adjust the numbers based on that change as well. So just know that if you've got any exemptions, or what the rules are on free foods also, that's an important thing as well. So things like seasonings, sauces, condiments, sugar-free, this and that and the other thing. I mean, do those things matter according to the source for your targets that you received? So I set those things pretty clearly for the people that I work with. I say, here are your numbers. Here are the things that I want you to track. And oftentimes, like the default thing that I will go with, more often than not, is we're going to track everything, absolutely everything, unless it's a condiment or seasoning that's 5 calories per serving or less. And then the expectation is, you're not using 10 servings of that. So, which sometimes that's not a safe default assumption to make, because I know a lot of people with their mustard and their ketchup, they kind of go crazy with it. Just understand, wherever those numbers are coming from, by default, if they don't say anything, like if you get it from an online calculator, and it's like, here are your numbers. I would assume that the expectation is that you log absolutely everything with no exceptions whatsoever. So that would be my expectation. If I was going to an online calculator and they were spitting some numbers at me, that's how I would assume things would look. So, so additional guidelines. So there are certain tenets that I believe in when it comes to dieting, and this applies whether we're following a meal plan or a macronutrient-based plan. So that'd be things regarding meal composition, like all meals should have a protein source, a complete protein source. So, black beans, they are a carb source, but they're relatively high in protein, not a complete protein source, however. So for those, you're looking at, animal products, soy products. There are some grains that are complete proteins as well, but you can't rely on those for a protein source just because they're predominantly carbohydrates. And if you wanted to get an appropriate serving of protein, you need to send your carbs absolutely through the roof. So, a protein source with each meal. I would also provide some guidelines on carbohydrate timing, especially if they are scarce. So, if we are trying to cut and carbs are relatively low, timing matters a lot more for carbohydrates then. So I would say, pre and post workout meals need to be the points of emphasis there. If carbs are a little bit higher, I'd still want a generous serving pre and post workout, but then we can work them in, throughout the day as desired pretty much. Same thing with fats. I don't have particular rules or guidelines like here's where we need to put our dietary fats, but kind of just spread them throughout the day is a nice, easy way to approach it. So another thing that some people can do, especially if you're cutting, so calories are a little bit lower, you're worried about overall food volume, caloric balance between meals. Those are things to be concerned about, not because you need those things to be a certain way so that you get the changes that you want in your physique, but just so that you can make the whole thing a little bit more comfortable. Like you don't want a 400 calorie meal and a 100 calorie meal because there's going to be that stretch during that later meal where you're starving, because 100 calories ain't nothing. So it might be more beneficial to set up a couple of 250 calorie meals or a 300 and a 200. So you can kind of position your carbs and fats throughout the day so you don't have a meal that's just protein, but you have, and then another one that's proteins, carbs, and fats. So take either the carbs and the fats and move it to another meal. So that's just a strategizing thing to try and, specifically when you're cutting and you're at a deficit, to try and make things a little bit more bearable. So, and then also playing the food volume game as well. So volume is really important, going with, excuse me, going with high volume foods. So things like veggies, things like, let's say potatoes over rice. A potato is going to be higher volume of food for the same amount of carbs than a serving of rice would be. Going with a solid protein meal like chicken, ground turkey, as opposed to a protein shake. Not a lot of volume in that, and also liquids and solids are handled differently by your stomach. So solids are certainly always going to be more filling. So those are things to all consider. So we're tracking numbers, but there are also additional guidelines. There are additional considerations. Some of those are not necessarily set in stone, but they're just things that are designed to help make the plan a little bit easier. Not necessarily more effective, but just easier. Okay, so what are the macros specifically? So, I've had this conversation with a lot of people where, it's like, do you want to follow a meal plan or a macro-based plan? And more often than not, an answer that I'll get back, or a question would be, well, what's a macro-based plan? I'm like, well, it's a macronutrient-based plan where you're just logging your foods and tracking macronutrients. Okay, well, what are macronutrients? I've had that conversation a lot. So when you're first starting out, I always tell people there's no such thing as a dumb question, and that includes this. So, it's certainly not default knowledge that we're all born with. So everybody's got to learn this at some point. So the macros that we care about: proteins, carbs, and fats. And also, to some extent, fiber. We need to monitor that number a little bit. We'll talk more about that momentarily here. So proteins, these are, the building blocks of muscle. Proteins necessary for protein synthesis. As bodybuilders, we need to have a relatively high protein intake. It does not necessarily need to be through the roof, but it needs to be higher than that of the average person, just because we're trying to build muscle. Protein is, the building block of that. So your protein sources, these would be, animal products. Anything that comes from an animal is going to be a complete protein source and would be suitable for this. So you've got a lot of options here, especially if you're following a macronutrient-based plan. There's, a wide variety. So chicken, turkey, beef, steak, bison, all various forms of that. So ground chicken, ground turkey, chicken breast, chicken strips, chicken patties, turkey patties, hamburger patties. You've got a lot of options just in that family. Eggs, egg whites, dairy products, assuming that you don't have any kind of dairy sensitivity. That would certainly be a bad idea. One other guideline that I always give people is avoid foods that cause digestive issues with your body. So, that's not necessarily because you can't make gains that way, but you're going to be uncomfortable. So it's certainly a consideration. If there's something you don't process dairy well, I wouldn't make that a part of your regular plan. So all those things for protein, dairy, like Greek yogurt, milk, whey protein, etc. You can find some lactose-free protein. So we've also got protein powder, protein bars. Definitely not one of my favorites. I certainly wouldn't recommend a protein bar as like a daily thing, but more of like a stopgap solution, just because they're typically not terribly high quality. There are exceptions to that, but the exceptions are fairly rare and not necessarily easy to find. You might have to order some of that stuff. You're not going to come across it in your stores necessarily. So carbs, these would be fish or complete protein. Ask Dave on Instagram. Yes, absolutely. Good question. Thank you. I always forget about fish because I hate it, and so it's just not at the forefront of my mind. I don't eat fish. Oftentimes, just so that people won't challenge me on that, I tell them that I'm allergic to it. Just because I don't want them to say, "Oh no, you should really try that." Sorry, I'm allergic. I can't do it. But yeah, fish, anything. I mean, yeah, fish, I guess we would consider, it's not just mammals, it's any animal. So, Jayhawk's Life, I think all meats are complete proteins. Yes, they absolutely are. So, and that includes fish, so also like shrimp, squid, octopus, lobster, ocean spiders, all that garbage, bottom-feeding crap. They're all complete proteins. And I understand a lot of people think they're very, very tasty. It's just that all of you people are wrong. So, and that's non-negotiable. But if you want to create a plan, a macronutrient-based plan for yourself around those things, I applaud you. Just keep it away from me. So. Carbohydrates. So these would be things like grains, starches, fruits, sugars, all that stuff. One guideline that I forgot before that I will typically advocate for people is, high sugar foods, just for reasons of blood sugar and insulin management. We want to keep kind of to that post-workout window. So that includes fruits. So having a piece of fruit before bed if you worked out in the morning, nah, not a good idea. Not a good idea. But it's healthy. I know it's healthy, but it's still sugar. So, whether it's sugar in the form of a Hershey bar or sugar in the form of a fruit, as far as bodybuilding is concerned, your body's going to treat those pretty much the same way. So they're going to cause very similar levels of spikes that we don't necessarily want outside of certain windows. So carbs, you've got, rice, potato, oats, cream of rice, any kind of grain, quinoa, any kind of bread, anything flour-based, pasta, these are all carbs. All of these are fine. Also, there's nothing inherently evil about pasta. There's nothing inherently bad about white rice, white potatoes. There's this healthy eating mindset going around that any white carbs are bad. You should avoid those. And honestly, I don't know where that came from. I have read that in books. I have followed people, doctors, medical professionals who advocate that, and they're just wrong. So Frankie says, pasta. Yes, sir. Absolutely. The trick with pasta and a lot of these things is just, I think we've been conditioned that these are bad for us just because in the US especially, we tend to eat these things in huge quantities, more than would be necessary. So I will back up and revise my previous statement. All of these foods are fine as long as you're measuring things and tracking your portion sizes. So whether it's a white potato or a sweet potato or some kind of generic pasta or whole grain pasta or Ezekiel bread or Wonder bread, this, that, and the other thing, it doesn't matter. As long as you're tracking things and your macros are coming out to where they need to be and you're hitting the other guidelines as well, you're in good shape. So the other thing where carbs tend to sneak in is sweets, sugars, condiments. So like ketchup is something where if you use a ton of that on something, you're gonna up your carb count, and it's all coming from sugars as well. So you kind of need to be mindful of that. Dave said on Instagram says, I've been told it's because they are bleached. Yeah, so they're being processed for sure, but that what that does, and this is a great point actually. So I think where the problem comes with a lot of this stuff is it has been processed, it has been bleached, and it has been stripped of its micronutrient value. So and that applies to a lot of these white products, white bread, white rice, etc. So in being stripped of its micronutrient value, these are things like vitamins, minerals, etc. It makes it a little less nutrient dense, a little bit more closer to the realm of like empty calories, but we're talking about macronutrients. We're not talking about micronutrients. And if you're relying on your grains and your carbs to hit your micronutrient targets, you're already screwed. You should be getting that from, certainly they have some value, but most of that you're going to be getting from veggies, etc. You can supplement with that stuff as well. Just part of our normal diet. the way that we've constructed things in this country, it's fairly difficult to become deficient in anything to any kind of serious degree. So, but again, if you're relying on, your pasta in order to hit your, your vitamin B6 allotment, you're already screwed. So, yeah, but that is a great point. That's probably where that mindset comes from. That's a good point. So, fats. So these would be things like oils, nuts, nut butters, peanut butter, almond butter, almonds, cashews, walnuts, pecans, macadamia nuts, any kind of oil, olive oil, coconut oil, macadamia nut oil, oil, avocados themselves. All of those things are fat. So think about, anything where, if it's not a solid, if you get some on your fingers and it doesn't wash off just with water, that's a fat. That's the easiest way for somebody that's like having a tough time wrapping their brain around what is actually a fat. If it requires soap to wash it off with something thoroughly, then yes, that's a fat. And then also just know that if you take any of those nuts and you ground them up, you're going to get that same kind of thing. So like peanut butter on the fingers, you know what I'm talking about there. So, and also a lot of protein sources come with dietary fats built in as well. So these would be things like chicken thighs are higher in fat than chicken breasts. Chicken breasts still have some fat. It's, I would say it's negligible. I mean, we still track that, but it doesn't add up super quickly. Chicken thighs, it will. Less lean versions of ground turkey and ground beef. If you get ground turkey, it's like 93.7, 85.15. Ground beef in the same number ranges as well. Steak, egg yolks, as opposed to just egg whites. So whole eggs would be a fat source as well. So you got a lot of fat sources. I'll take somebody and, maybe start their fats at something kind of low, like 40 grams, and then I bump it up to 60, and they're like, boy, I don't know how I can get up to 60. I'm like, well, if you add a tablespoon of olive oil, that'll take you from 40 to 55 right there. Fats are so easy, just because those numbers, your fat targets are never going to be super high. Like, your protein may be 250 grams if you're a guy, something like that. Your fats probably aren't going to be 250. So it's really easy to sneak those fats in. Just a tablespoon of oil here, swap out chicken breast for some 85-15 ground turkey. That's going to throw you about 20 grams of fat for a reasonable size serving. The fats can add up really quick. A tablespoon of peanut butter, great. There's about 8 grams right there. Easy stuff. So, the other thing with fats is I always advocate it's important for people to get a variety from their fat sources. So, if I set a target of, 80 grams for fat and somebody puts together a meal plan, they leave all the fats out, but they've got their carbs hit, they've got their proteins hit, and they're like, all right, well, I'm just going to get peanut butter for all my fats. No. Not all fats are created equal. There are different classifications of fats. You've got your saturated, unsaturated, polyunsaturated, monounsaturated. You've got omega-3, 6, 9. There's different ratios of those. So it's important to get a variety of fats. You don't need to say like, okay, here's 10 different sources and I need to get all of these every day. But at the same time, don't rely heavily on just like one or two. But get a variety. So like coconut oil is great. I can't stand coconut oil myself. MCT oil, same thing basically. It's just liquid form instead of being solid at room temperature, and it's typically unflavored. So very easy thing to add to a protein shake to add an extra 15 grams of fat for a full tablespoon. You can also do a smaller serving than that. Keep in mind 3 teaspoons per tablespoon, so you can add a teaspoon to get 5 grams. So that's why on fat specifically, I really advocate being very accurate on your numbers, very precise, having a high level of expectation as far as your precision on those numbers, because it is really easy to micromanage that. Just add a teaspoon of oil here and there. Here's an extra 5 grams. There's no reason why that shouldn't be able to get right within 2 grams of the target for fat. So let's see. Another thing there is when you're doing macronutrient plans, and this is again my rule, not necessarily a universal one, don't track calories. Pretend the calorie number is not there. Track your grams of protein, your grams of carbs, and your grams of fat. The calorie is a derivative number based on those 3 and also fiber. The way that the math works with fiber can be a little confusing and it's not necessarily consistent. And so if you run all of those through a formula, you will find that your calorie number may be off by a little bit. That is irrelevant. So hit your grams of protein, your grams of carbs, your grams of fat. And if I'm specifying a fiber target, which I always am, just make sure that you're hitting something close to that. and then just track your regularity. So how frequently you're going to the bathroom. And if it becomes an issue, then we're going to take a closer look at that number. For the most part, people have a range. Everybody's a little bit different, but everybody has a range where their fiber intake should be, and that's also got to be closely balanced with your water intake. So you'll know if it's a problem, and if it's a problem, then we'll start to look at it. We'll look at fiber intake and find ways to increase it or adjust water intake. So now there are a lot of ways to approach this. So we've got a macronutrient-based plan. So what do? We've got all these numbers. We're going to use an app to log everything, something like MyFitnessPal. There are other apps as well. I should know more names of them, but realistically, MyFitnessPal is the one that I use. It's the only one that I recommend to clients, simply because if they have issues with it, I use it as well, so I can talk them through and give them a little tech support on how the app works if necessary. So I hate to promote a monopoly in the industry, but they've got a good app, so I recommend it. So several ways to approach this. You can fly by the seat of your pants, totally. So approach a day without a plan. Say, I'm going to have this. I'm going to have this. Oh, it's time to eat again. I'm going to have this. I'm going to have this. And you're logging all this stuff. And then at the end of the day, just kind of see what happens, kind of monitor your totals throughout the day, see how close you're getting, and then make adjustments. That's a terrible way to do it. Just an absolutely terrible way to do it. It's a great way to set yourself up to be super inaccurate. It's also a great way to miss your targets completely. And it's a great way to spend way too much time thinking about this stuff and doing stuff throughout the day as well. Jayhawk's Life says, eat this much works pretty well also. Yes, it does. So you can also set up a plan where you create some stock meals, and then you have some improvisation. Like you will know, like, okay, well, meal one is always going to be this, and then my lunch meal is always going to be this, and my afternoon snack is always going to be this, and so you can kind of log those in advance, and then set yourself up with some freedom for dinner, because maybe you and your spouse, you like to cook something, you like to have stuff together, whatever. You don't necessarily want to have the same thing every day. So you can set yourself up with a plan where you basically set aside a block of macros. Like, okay, well, I've got 30 grams of protein, 40 grams of carbs, and 10 grams of fat set aside for dinner here. So, there's a lot of different foods that we can use to make that. So we'll just make something, and then I will portion out the pieces of that to get close to those numbers. Okay, that's not bad. And for somebody who's trying to find a little bit of balance, what that does is it sets you up where you're still prepping a good amount of stuff in advance. You're still in a routine. You're still giving yourself consistency, but you're also making it easier for yourself as well, because you're setting up a whole bunch of stuff that you don't necessarily have to think about. So, if the numbers that, again, we'll go back to that earlier example, your numbers are 150, 150, 50. Let's say you set aside 30, 40, and 10 for that meal. Really, if that's kind of your wild card meal where you give yourself some flexibility, you don't have to track anything else. Just track that day and know that your targets are 30, 40, 10, or whatever I just said. I think it was 30, 40, 10. That makes it a lot easier, because then you're only tracking, you're only doing math, you're only using your app for one meal of the day. The rest of them, those are on plan. Now, it's a plan that you've created yourself, but you know what those numbers add up to, and you know what kind of a hole it leaves in your plan. So then you don't have to go and say, okay, well, I have this meal every day, I have to log this, I have to log this. If you're consistent with it and you've got just like one thing, one meal per day that is variable, great. Just make that the only thing that you track and just know what your numbers are. Or let's say you've set aside 2 meals, and you've set aside your macros for those 2 meals as being, 60, 75, and 20. Great. So track those 2 meals and know that those are your targets. You're basically just taking a good portion of your day and making it a constant, and then taking the numbers that you actually track and just making those much smaller. So you have a really small set of macros that you're tracking, but you only apply it to 2 meals, and then you've got 3 or 4 others throughout the day that are always the same, and those are constant. So it's another thing to consider. It's not a bad approach. Now, the way that I typically advocate this is just because this is the easiest way to go. It takes a little bit of planning on the forefront, but it is a little bit easier overall. And that is just to use the macros that you have to create your own meal plan, and then just follow that. So, and I'll have clients that do that, and I always say, great, okay, you've done that. Let me take a look at it. Let me see if I can, first of all, check your number accuracy on stuff, make recommendations on, any kind of changes to meal composition, basically just kind of running it past through a little bit of a checker on the guidelines that I've established, and make sure that they followed all of those. And then if so, great, we're in good shape. So that is what I would recommend doing. So, and I give people guidelines like, if your protein target's 150 grams, figure out how many meals per day you want to eat. Let's say it's 5. Okay, great. There's nothing wrong with that. 2, you can do it, but there's going to be 2 giant meals. You've got big gaps in there. Your nitrogen balance levels are going to be low because your protein intake has such huge spikes and dips throughout the day. So I don't typically recommend that. 5, great. 4, okay. 6, awesome. Just because it's more even and more steady that way. So figure out how many meals per day you're going to eat. Take your total grams of protein and divide it by that number. So if you've got 150 grams, and then you're going to eat 5 meals a day, that's nice and easy, 30 grams per meal. I did that without a calculator. I are smart. I went to engineering school for 3.5 years to be able to do that in my head. So 30 grams per meal, great. That's easy. So, it's like, 4.5 ounces of chicken, something like that. It's a, slightly heaping scoop of a typical protein powder. The issue then becomes, okay, well, I'm going to have a meal that's a Greek yogurt meal. Red alert, that's going to be like 15 to 18 grams. You're way short of your average. So do you make that up by having one meal that's way higher? I think it's better to try and supplement that earlier meal, the Greek yogurt meal, with some additional protein to get it closer to the average, just so that things are a little bit more even, and then you don't have a meal later where you've got to try and make up 45 grams of protein. Jayhawk's Life on Instagram, snacks versus meals. Yeah, so I don't differentiate. My definition is always anytime you open your mouth and put food in it, we are calling it a meal. So even if it's smaller, that's fine. Because sometimes, you're rushed for time. You don't have time to sit down and microwave up some giant bowl of, schlurm-derm with like chicken and veggies and rice and crap in there. So, you might need to create a snack, something that's like, protein shake and some peanut butter or some nuts or something like that. Or maybe it's a protein bar. Again, I wouldn't recommend that on a daily thing, but here and there, I'd consider that a snack. We're still going to call it a meal though, just because I don't want to start to differentiate and say, okay, well, your snacks need to look like this, but your meals need to look like this. It doesn't matter. I prefer more even intake throughout the day. So like I mentioned before, avoid having like a 600 calorie meal and a 200 calorie meal, or 200 calorie snack, I guess, but maybe something closer to like 400 would be a little bit more ideal. Not necessarily essential, but again, just for comfort more than anything else, to try and balance out your appetite. So if you create your own meal plan, you just tend to follow that most of the time, that's great. And then, you've created that meal plan, you're familiar with macronutrients, you're familiar with how the app works, you're familiar with where these numbers are coming from, what the sources are. So then as you need to, as circumstances come up where you need to make adjustments, you've got the skills to be able to do that. You know how to modify your plan at that point. Like, oh, I made this plan, well, now we want to go out for dinner, so okay. And you've got to think ahead a little bit, like where are we going? What do they have? What kind of options are there? What kind of macronutrient gap or hole can I leave in my day for that meal? And then kind of like I talked about before, how you might have several meals that are stock and always the same, and then you kind of leave yourself a set of macros for a meal or two, something like that. You can play that same kind of game here, but just not like on an everyday basis. So most of the days are going to look the same, but if there's a day that's different, going to a party, date out with a spouse, whatever, you've got the skills and the ability to make adjustments to the plan and kind of modify things, do a little bit of work beforehand, maybe leave out a fat source from earlier in the day to leave more fats for later. Nothing wrong with that. That's what I call sustainability. That's about taking a plan and making it something that can work for you in the long term. So on constructing the plan, the recommendation that I gave up at the top on meal composition, carb timing, protein distribution, etc., all those things need to be considered. I actually talked about this. I was looking at my notes earlier. I'm like, wow, did I not write this stuff? I did. It's in this section down here. So we already kind of talked about how to construct the plan. So carb timing, again, depends on the scarcity of carbs. Are they just going to be pre-workout and post-workout? Do we have enough to spread into other meals as well? As far as how many carbs should be pre and post-workout, it really depends. It depends on how scarce they are. It depends on how big of a person you are, gender, your training style, etc. Typically, like 25 grams pre and post is a good starting point. Up to, like for a guy on average, I kind of favor something around 40 to 50 grams. So, and then certainly if you're on the higher end of things, you're a really big dude, then or big lady. Something even higher than that, like for women, 50, 60 grams pre and post. Guys, 80, 90, 100 grams pre and post, certainly not unreasonable. Shantae on Instagram says, enjoying my post-workout English muffin right now. We did talk about that. I'm glad that you are taking advantage of that. So nicely done. So Jayhawk's Life says, making it through the Christmas party tonight thanks to macros. Yes, I've done that before. One other thing on that, just a side note. At a party like that, I'll go into it and I'll have an expectation like, okay, this is what I need to fit. These are the macros that I need to stay within. So that's going to guide my selection on things. And then, it's a buffet or whatever. You go and you get your plate, just whip out your phone, take a quick picture of it, log it later. If the numbers don't come out exactly right, that's okay. But then you're not relying on your memory. You've got a photo in there so that you can see everything that is there. And then oftentimes, if I'm being a real dork, I'll actually take a picture of the plate with my hand next to it, just as like a size reference. So I can say, oh, okay, well that pile of stuff there is about the size of the palm of my hand, so I'm going to eyeball it. That's probably around 3 ounces or something like that. So it could be a helpful little tip. So fats we talked about, maybe keep those separate from carbs. It depends on if they're scarce. Having a meal that's protein and carb and protein, carb, and protein and fat versus a protein, carb, fat meal, and then just a protein meal later on. So that's something that's worth considering as well. So the logging basics. So first of all, if you're using an app like MyFitnessPal, it has a barcode scanner built into it, which means that any packaged food, there's zero margin of error in that. You know exactly what it is, but there are mistakes that happen there. So be mindful of that. And the big thing that I want to talk about here is that everything has got to pass the smell test when you're logging. So when in doubt, scan the barcodes. But if you shop at a place like Trader Joe's, for example, you will find if you scan enough stuff in there, you will scan the barcode and it comes up with something completely different than what you're holding in your hand. And I don't know if Trader Joe's like reuses barcodes for seasonal items or something like that, but I've scanned a package of like diced prosciutto, something that my wife makes, actually, prosciutto and Brussels sprouts. It's awesome. But it'll come up as like something completely different. Like I have no idea what that is. So then I just search for it by name instead, and eventually it'll come up and I can find it. So just don't assume that the barcode scanner is foolproof. It's pretty good, but it can pull up the wrong thing every now and then. And then, just the other thing about passing things through the smell test is just making sure that things look correct. One other thing when you scan stuff is that sometimes the portion size or the serving size that's listed on the nutritional facts of the package does not match what comes up by default when you barcode scan something in. So it may say like, oh, there are 2 servings in this package, and then you scan it and the serving size is way different, and it doesn't tell you how many servings there are per package, but if you do the math, it's like, oh, well, there's 5 servings according to this. So then you've got to just do a double check, look at the numbers, and see if there's any kind of correction that has to be made there. As far as passing the smell test, this is about experience and knowing what the values are supposed to be. If you search for chicken breasts on MyFitnessPal, you will find a wide range of entries in their database. Some of them are good, some of them are not. You will find some that say an ounce of chicken breast cooked has 4 grams of protein or 10 grams of protein. The correct number is about 6.5 to 7 grams of protein per ounce. So you've just got to know. You've got to be able to identify when something is wrong. Chicken breast should not have a bunch of fat. If you find something where an ounce of chicken breast says it has 1.5 grams of fat, that is incorrect. You should be looking at about 2 to 2.5 grams for like a 6-ounce serving. So closer to 0.5 gram per ounce or a little bit or a little bit less. Dean says he's late. That's why I got distracted there. Good to have you nonetheless. We're about done, but it's good to have you. So just run everything through your bullshit detector, basically. You've got to have a sense, and you'll develop this, of whether things are correct or not. Another thing where people often fall into a trap is, they search for rice and they will pull up an entry for uncooked rice when they're measuring out cooked rice. So just make sure that whatever you're using, however you're measuring it, matches the entry in the database. So don't measure out cooked chicken and then log an entry for raw chicken, because those values are going to be different. So again, I've said it many times, but just run it through your BS detector. And your BS detector is something that gets refined the more you do this. And also for my clients, I serve as a BS detector also. So when we're first starting out, I'll want to see some of your logs, just because I know how it works in something like MyFitnessPal, you start logging stuff, and then those database entries that you find initially, those are the ones that you reuse over and over again because they come up on your recently used list. And so we need to make sure that those are accurate, just because you're going to be relying on those daily or several times a day. So we need to make sure that those are accurate just because of how frequently they're going to get used. And if there's error in those, a small error can compound into a huge error over time if you keep using that same entry. So that's pretty much it. Now, I may have missed some stuff, and I would like to do a follow-up on this maybe next week. If anybody has questions, send them to me on Instagram. You can just message them to me. I do actually still see all the messages that come into my Instagram account. So you can send them to me there. YouTube, if you want to leave comments, you can do that. You can also just email me. It's Darin at 5starfitness.com. You can go to the website, click on contact, and fill out the form there. Anything that you'd like to see me follow up with here, by the way, that website is 5starphysique.com. Contact, fill out the form. Hit me up. I'd be happy to talk about this stuff again. It might be worth a follow-up. I've talked about this before, but I think that each time I do it, I can kind of refine the presentation a little bit better as well. So this was covering everything in right about 45 minutes. So I'm pretty happy with how it turned out here. So once again, just summarizing the stuff from the very beginning. New video up last week, new one going up tomorrow or Friday. There's a new workout plan on the website as well, specifically designed for off-season. And also, I would absolutely love it and appreciate it beyond words if you could go onto iTunes and review this podcast. Search for The Drop Set on iTunes under podcasts and leave me a review. I did mention there's a 2-star review hanging out there, and it annoys me. So I got to step up my game so I don't earn another one of those. But be honest. I'm not gonna say you've got to give me a 5-star review. Just be honest. Leave some feedback as well. I appreciate it. I read all that stuff too. So thank you all for watching, tuning in. I appreciate it. I hope everybody has a great Christmas. This is the time, by the way. Enjoy the time with your family. Don't stress out over food. That has been pretty much a universal note that I've been passing along to all of my clients this week. I don't have anybody right now. There's no shows next weekend or anything like that. Nobody's a week out at this point. So, and the reason for that is because of the holidays. So you might be prepping for a show if you're doing one in March, April. But there's time. Be reasonable about it. But don't miss out on good stuff, family times, creating memories just because you have to be on your plan. That is a great way to make everybody hate the fact that you're doing bodybuilding. So be reasonable and just enjoy yourself. So I hope everybody has a great time. I'll be back here next week. If anybody has any ideas, recommendations on what to talk about, I'm a clean slate right now. I don't have a plan set up for next week. I'll start working on that pretty much as soon as I hit stop on this recording here. So again, thanks everybody for watching on Instagram, on YouTube. I appreciate it. Listening at home, wherever you are. Thank you. Any feedback, always welcome. I hope everybody has a fantastic week and a good holiday. I'll see you next week.